Hello, my name is David Patterson, and this is my final project presentation for Western Civ 2, Europe in the Modern World. And for my primary source, I have chosen Grimm's Fairy Tales by the German brothers Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm in Germany. The first volume was published in 1812, and it was titled Kinder- und Hausmärchen, which meant children's and household tales. The brothers gathered their stories mostly from middle-class and educated young women, most notably including the Hassenpluff sisters, Dorothy Wilde, who later married Wilhelm Grimm, and a couple of literate men, Johannes Dietz and Friedrich Krauss. Most of the tales were written down, not truly passed on orally, and many were of French origin. And so I have three different historical questions. The first one is, where did the two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, get their original inspiration to write these fairy tales, and what motivated them? And for that question, the source I used was The Brothers Grimm and the Hermeneutics of Folklore, an Overview. And then for my second question, which was, during the early days of the book's publication and thereafter, was the collection of fairy tales received as the Brothers Grimm's intended? What was their target audience? What were their intentions? And did they successfully achieve what they intended? And for that question, I used the source of Review of Grimm Legacies, The Magic Spell of the Grimm's Folk and Fairy Tales by Jack Zipes. And then for the third question, it was, how did the themes and morality in Grimm's fairy tales reflect on the Germans who they were collected from, the Grimm's brothers themselves, and how did they evolve and compare to fairy tales now? And for that question, I used the source of Fairy Tales Unmasked, Analyzing the Layers of Morality in Grimm versus Disney Stories for Children's Literature. All right. So I'll start with the first question, which was... Well, before I get into that, I'm going to give you some more information. So Grimm's Fairy Tales was historically significant in the context of Romanticism in the early 1800s. Romanticism was sort of a folk movement at the time. And just so you know, what I'm talking about right here is this is all coming from the textbook, the class textbook. At the time, there was no German nation, and there never had been. Romanticism was a sort of folk movement. And although there was no German nation, or never had been, there was the idea that folk tradition and the essence of a people lived on through oral tradition, even though civilization had taken over. Romanticists such as the Brothers Grimm believed that essence and identity could be captured by interviewing people who had stories to pass along. The Romantic people movement became a seed for nationalism, as it was rooted in the idea of a people having a shared identity and spirit. All right. And so my main goal with the questions was to get a full, as complete as possible picture of the evolution of the Grimm's fairy tales. I was interested in knowing what the original intention and morality was for the Grimm brothers, and I was also interested to know how their stories evolved over time and became what they were today. I was pleasantly surprised to learn so much more than I had originally intended, especially about the themes of the original tales. So the first historical question, where did the two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, get their original inspiration to write these fairy tales, and what motivated them? So for many, the Romantic movement in Germany turned their attention towards the past. Many poets and writers thought of medieval literature as a motivation or inspiration for new writing, but some, such as the Grimm brothers, saw it as a way to look into the past and understand the German culture and people better. The Romantic movement in Germany, a movement in the arts that favored a return to nature and a greater focus on national culture, especially folk tales, awakened the Germans' interest in the past of their own country. The Grimm brothers had been in contact with the Romantic poets Clemens Clemens Brentano, and Achim von Arnim, men who were preparing their own collection of folk songs. And it's very likely that that the Brothers Grimm drew inspiration from them in terms of motivation and potentially even methods for collecting stories. Wilhelm collected the stories orally and utilized scholarly footnotes for the sources and different versions of the tales. Some of them were collected orally, and then others were actually written down. Quite a few of them actually were written down and passed on. But the brothers, they kind of took those stories, including like the ones that were written down, and they rewrote them to sound as if they were passed on orally. So Wilhelm collected the stories orally, utilized scholarly footnotes for the sources and different versions of the tale. The tales were different from the extravagant fantasy of Romantic school's poetical fairy tales. The Grimm's tales conveyed the soul, imagination, and beliefs of the German people over the centuries. The great merit of Wilhelm Grimm is that he gave the fairy tales a readable form without changing their folkloric character, and as Maria Tatar concluded, the results were threefold. The collection enjoyed wide distribution in Germany and eventually in all parts of the globe. It became and remains a model for the collecting of folk tales everywhere, and the Grimm's footnotes to the tales, along with other investigations, form the basis for the science of the folk narrative and even of folklore. For some years, the brothers had been in contact with the Romantic poets Clemens Brentano and Achim von Arnim, who were preparing a collection of German folk songs. Okay, so the Grimm brothers wanted to preserve disappearing cultural and oral traditions, and they believed that folk tales preserved the German national identity. So they decided that preserving folk tales was the best way to do it. Many of the stories, which took place in rural locations, were more of an idealized version of peasant life, as the stories came largely from a middle-class demographic that were part of the Grimm's social circle, the Brothers Grimm's. They were, however, certainly a reflection of the imagination of the German people and had an air of wonder to them. The Grimm brothers weren't the very first to produce a wonder tale, as Charlie Perrault's Tales of Mother Goose had appeared in 1697 and was likely an inspiration, although the Grimm brothers' style and attitude were different. They believed that folk stories handed down by word of mouth expressed the fundamental ideas, beliefs, and reactions to human experience of the folk. As Jacob Grimm pointed out during his search for a publisher, the main purpose of the proposed volume was not as much to earn royalties as to salvage what was left of the priceless national resources still in the hands of the German folk. The Grimm brothers expressed the hope that the volume in the offering would find friends everywhere and that it would entertain the entire mankind. The collecting of folk tales fitted beautifully into this search for a pure native voice, unspoiled by the corrupting influence of industrialization. These folk tales were culturally valuable and did not need to be transformed in any way. So, my second question, during the early days of the book's publication and thereafter, was the collection of fairy tales received as the Grimm brothers intended? What was their target audience and what were their intentions? And did they successfully achieve what they intended? So first off, the Grimm's tales were not strictly speaking fairy tales, nor were they intended for children specifically. Their main purpose was to preserve the German national identity and oral tradition, and so their target audience at first was largely for adults, although children were still included within that. Zipes points out, the Grimms began developing the corpus of their tales with the purpose of preserving an ancient tradition of storytelling. They aimed to save the folk and fairy tales from extinction and to bequeath this Natrapoesie as a gift to the German people of all social classes. In the first edition preface, they defend including materials some saw as unsuitable for children, proving that they did not intend children as their target audience. Zipes points out that objections have been raised that parents might not want to put the book in the hands of children. On the whole, it is not is certainly not necessary. So, Edgar Taylor's English translation in 1823 to 26 drastically changed how the Grimm's fairy tales were received. Taylor's edition created some major myths that contradicted the Grimm's intention, including that the tales were primarily intended for children, that the Grimm brothers collected the tales from peasants, which was untrue. It was from middle-class people. Due to this misinterpretation and due to Taylor's success with his English translations, the Grimm brothers were kind of pushed to change the format of their fairy tales to cater to younger readers. As a consequence, the brothers did release the small edition in 1825 to appeal to the bourgeoisie children and their families. This was not the Grimm's original intention. Taylor's success pushed the Grimms to change their own format. So next, part of the question. Early reception did not match the Grimm brothers' original intention. According to Agarwal and Hazra, the first volumes were criticized because although they were called children's tales, they were not regarded as suitable for children, especially for the subject matter. The 1823 English translation changed their reputation. Edgar Taylor's translation turned the tales into children's literature, shifting their purpose. This was partially because of what a difference the illustrations made, making the literature more children-friendly, diverting from the original purpose of the writings, which contradicts the cultural and scholarly purpose of their writing. The Grimm's brothers would later continue to alter later editions, going on to print more than 6 more editions, making them more child-friendly and adding in Christian references and removing the mentioning of fairies, which diverted the aura of wonder more towards a slightly religious moral undertone. This change in focus was motivated by readers' expectations rather than their original intention. Later on, reception moved even further from the brothers' original intentions. According to Agarwal and Hazra, many changes were made, such as transforming the wicked mother into a stepmother, removing sexual references. However, oddly, violence was increased in many of the tales. Later on down the road, Disney, as well as social and commercial pressures, further pushed the modern versions of the fairy tales into safe entertainment for kids. At one point, the Nazis even approved of Grimm's tales, using them as justification to uphold the racist and nationalist supremacy of the German people. This is one of the most radically unintended consequences of the Grimm brothers' original hopes for their tales. Now we finally have the third question. How did the themes of morality in Grimm's fairy tales reflect on the Germans who they were collected from, the Grimm's brothers themselves, and how did the tales evolve and compare to fairy tales now? So first, the Grimm tales reflect the difficult social and economic realities of 19th century Germany. One example is Hansel and Gretel. The children are abandoned due to famine because their parents are unable to provide for their children due to the scarcity of food. Divya and Ra point out how that situation addresses the moral complexities involved in survival. It was a reflection of the deep fears and moral dilemmas of the Germans during times of famine and difficult economic times, challenging the values of familial loyalty, bravery, and resilience in the face of hardship. As for the Grimm brothers themselves, the tales reveal that the Grimm brothers valued cultural preservation and nationalism, as Divya and Ra pointed out, that the Grimms were part of Volkskunde, which means the study of folklore, to preserve the expressions of the collective spirit of the German people. Also, the tales show that the Grimms valued realism, as many of the stories they collected had dark themes, moral ambiguity, and ethical complexity. Over time, the fairy tales have evolved drastically. The modern Disney adaptations are simplified, optimistic, and child-friendly. Disney versions of fairy tales are usually about good versus evil and have happy endings. On the other hand, Grimm's original fairy tales are complex and morally ambiguous. Divya and Ra write that Grimm's tales have a brutal and unforgiving portrayal of morality with harsh and vividly depicted consequences. The characters often face complex dilemmas where right and wrong are not easily discernible. There are dark themes, death, betrayal, and personal suffering reflected in the harsh realities of life. Grimm's original tales are far different than their modern adaptations, and it makes sense because times are not nearly as harsh as they were back then. Standard of living has drastically decreased, And although many people still know harsh realities, modern culture typically demands a happy ending to stories, especially when it comes to children's stories. When you factor in the Christian influence, you can see the idea of morality evolving from moral ambiguity to good versus evil. The Grimm brothers thought that harsh realism and moral ambiguity would encourage children to think critically and analyze ethical dilemmas, while Disney stories seem to intend to help children to be more emotionally resilient by fostering hope and perseverance. Historical themes, I would say that the Grimm fairy tales are certainly most related to the broader theme of inclusion and exclusion. The brothers Grimm were inspired and motivated to cultivate the spirit of the German people and contribute to defining the German identity. It's ironic that the Nazis then used the Grimm brothers' work as a justification for German superiority. The Nazis twisted the original intention of inclusion for the German people and used it to exclude everyone else and justify genocide. And so that is my final project. Thank you.